Hey there, everybody. Just a quick note before we start our recording of the How to Define Antinatalism, a panel discussion event. David Pearce was indeed able to attend and join us for the event. You can see him in the video. However, he sadly experienced some technical difficulties, particularly with his microphone, that just could not be resolved in time. So he is there, but he wasn't able to communicate with us during the recording. He wasn't able to answer any of the questions that were posed to him. However, his critiques of the Cambridge definition of antinatalism, as well as his own original definition, were all pre-submitted. So when it was his turn to, recite those pieces of material, I stepped in and I was the one to read them. So that's why I just wanted to give a little bit of an explanation as to why things are the way they are. This is just a brief explanation. On with the show, and hope everybody enjoys. Welcome, everyone, to the How to Define Antinatalism, a panel discussion event, an antinatalist event like none other before it. Since the dawn of antinatalism as a philosophical term, discussion, and position in 2006, how we define ourselves as antinatalists has been the subject of much debate and consternation. Frustratingly, antinatalism has long been neglected by dictionaries around the world, despite significant increases in everyday usage on the internet, in media, and through publication year after year. In 2018, I twice campaigned to have antinatalism added into the Oxford English Dictionary, sadly to no avail. Over the last few years, Antinatalisme has appeared in two French dictionaries, Larousse and Le Robert, defined as which aims to reduce the birth rate and who seeks to limit the birth rate, Malthusian, supporter of an antinatalist policy. Definitions that perhaps more accurately defined what antinatalism may have meant prior to 2006. Sometime later, antinatalismo would find its way into the Portuguese dictionary Infopedia, defined there as a position of those who consider human procreation to be wrong or morally reprehensible. Getting closer, perhaps, but still not quite there. On December 31st of 2023, the word antinatalism was finally added into the Cambridge Dictionary, making it the very first English language dictionary definition, as far as we know, of the term. Cambridge defines antinatalism as anti-natalism, noun, in parentheses, also antinatalism as one word, the belief that it is morally wrong to have children or that people should be encouraged not to have children. Anti-natalism may sometimes be motivated by environmental concerns. Antinatalism, the belief that it is morally wrong to have kids, often comes from the negative perspective that all life is suffering. This definition, its successes, its failures, and how it could be improved upon will be the subject of today's discussion. Assembled here today, we have some of the most prominent experts in the field. We have asked each of our participants to think about the Cambridge definition, to consider what critiques or praises they might have of it. In addition, each participant has been asked to construct one or more new definitions of antinatalism based on the following criteria. 1. Good, useful dictionary definitions. 2. Good general definitions for discussions amongst antinatalists. 3. Good specific definitions that you think specify the most useful dimensions of antinatalism. Allow me now to welcome our esteemed guests. Professor David Benatar, author of Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, The Human Predicament, and Debating Procreation, amongst others, as well as the soon-to-be-released Very Practical Ethics. Welcome, Professor Benatar. Antinatalist philosopher and historian, author of many articles on antinatalism and 3 books on antinatalism, including the absolutely remarkable Antinatalism, a Handbook. Karim Akerma. Hello, Karim. Welcome. A popular antinatalist YouTuber and co-founder of the new Antinatalist Activist Collective and Antinatalist Advocacy, Lawrence Anton. Hello, Lawrence. Co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association and author of The Hedonistic Imperative, David Pearce. Hello, David. Welcome. I am Amanda Sukenick, the host of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, and moderating our event today is Professor of Philosophy of Management at Aalto University School of Business, author of many antinatalist works, and founder of the Risk Argument, Matti Häyry, in whose excellent hands I place us all into now.
Thank you, Amanda. We are discussing the definition of antinatalism and by implication antinatalist as a noun and as an adjective. Our starting point for the sake of convenience is Cambridge Dictionary's recent entry, which Amanda introduced just now. But let me say a few words about definitions more generally. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, definitions can be lexical, ostensive, or stipulative. Lexical definitions specify the meaning of an expression by stating it in terms of other expressions whose meaning is assumed to be known, as in a bitch is a female dog, wolf, fox, or otter, or as in antinatalism is the belief that it is morally wrong to have children. Lexical definitions can be useful, but they can also remain unspecific or equivocal. Ostensive definitions specify the meaning of an expression by pointing to examples of things to which the expression applies, as in green is the color of grass, or antinatalism is the philosophy that David Benatar advocates. These can include or exclude too little. Stipulative definitions assign a new meaning to an expression or a meaning to a new expression, as in by a grey object, I mean an object that is grey in the morning and blue in the evening. Or by antinatalism, I mean the view that all children should be killed. Well, these are stipulations, so everything goes, but of course some constraint could be used. Persuasive definitions are a subcategory of stipulative definitions that try to convince audiences by a mix of factual and emotional elements, as in a Democrat is a leftist who desires to overtax businesses, or a Democrat is a compassionate person who cares about the poor. Or an antinatalist is a monster who hates babies, or an antinatalist is a saint who loves humankind. These are not always conducive to rational discussion. Note that all these are nominal definitions, giving or clarifying the meaning of words. The alternative would be a real definition that reveals the essence or nature of an entity, as in a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points, or antinatalists are a quarreling online mob who hold conflicting views about life, death, and birth. Our best bet, I believe, is to avoid persuasion and realities and concentrate on the meaning of words. To that end, we have asked you to think of good, useful dictionary definitions, good general definitions for discussions among antinatalists, and good specific definitions that you think specify the most useful dimensions of antinatalism. But first, let's hear your opinions on the Cambridge Dictionary entry. And we are starting with Karim Akerma. Karim, you are on.
Many thanks, Matti, for your elaborations on how we may define the term definition. All right, and environmental concerns is only one of a series of other issues that can be brought forward in favor of antinatalism, such as humane concerns and or animal suffering with wars, disease, or disaster as specifications. While it is true that there are antinatalists who simply hold the belief that procreation is wrong, there is also antinatalism as a moral theory. As a moral theory, antinatalism is much more rational, better founded, and more open to criticism than a mere belief. Antinatalism also is a universal moral theory. Therefore, according to many antinatalists, it applies not only to human beings, but to all entities capable of suffering, that is, humans, animals, extraterrestrials, or possible man-made artificial creatures, or perhaps non-organismic creatures which one day we may find out in space. Rather than simply claiming that all life is suffering, many antinatalists hold that there is both suffering and pleasure in life, but that suffering is not compensated for by pleasure.
Thank you, Karim. I'm making a list of these. So after your response, I have one, environmental concerns are just one of many. Two, antinatalism is a theory as well as a mere belief. Three, as a theory, it's universal, not limited to humans. And four, that some, not necessarily all life is suffering, and that might be enough. But so, onward. Next up, we have Lawrence Anton. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Cheers, Matti. So I've got two main things to say about the definition itself, and then two things to comment on the notes that are included as well. So the first thing I wanted to comment on was the part of the definition that says it's morally wrong to have children. I personally think this unduly narrows the scope of antinatalism to just not bringing humans into existence and focuses on one behavior that I think antinatalism is relevant to. So I also think there are other behaviors antinatalism is relevant to, like not supporting the breeding of non-human animals. The other part of the definition that I have something to note on is where it says people should be encouraged not to have children. I think this is a call to action that can be motivated by an antinatalist view, but I don't think it should necessarily be in the definition of antinatalism itself. Then very quickly on the notes. So one of the notes said that it's sometimes motivated by environmental concerns. Obviously, this is true. But I would opt not to associate antinatalism too heavily with environmentalism for two main reasons. One is that it isn't always clear what the exact environmental impacts are of creating someone. The second is that putting an emphasis on the harms suffered by a person as a result of environmental degradation, I think unduly limits our analysis of the harms of coming into existence. And then the second was the note where it says often it comes from a negative perspective that all life is suffering. I think this mischaracterizes the antinatalist or most antinatalist positions. I think the position doesn't claim, nor does it need to, that all life is suffering. It's just that there will at least be some harms experienced by the being created. And often those will be very serious harms, or always those will be very serious harms, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all life is suffering. So yeah, those were my thoughts on the definition.
Thank you, Lawrence. And the new items on my list after your comments are: the universal or beyond human is also a feature of antinatalist practice, not only theory. Antinatalism, and this is number 6, that was number 5, antinatalism is not a call for action, to which I'm pretty sure I'll get opposition from others. 7, environmental concerns, in addition to being just one dimension, may actually be one dimension too many and confuse matters. And 8, continuing on Karim's theme, and that all life need not be suffering, we now have that any serious harm will do for the antinatalist cause. And then we have our channel host, Amanda Sukenick. Amanda, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Matti. The word belief, in my opinion, does nothing to specify that this is a philosophy or social movement or anything with much specificity. I don't think it's a wonderful choice of words to use. Morality might not be the best word either. Ethical might possibly be a better word to use. The phrase morally wrong to have children, in my opinion, limits the scope to just human beings and says nothing about why it might be wrong to have them. So limiting the scope, and also says nothing about the reasons why. The phrase should be encouraged not to have children says nothing about to what end, so that the population is reduced, so that it is limited, encouraged not to have children to the point of extinction. It leaves both the reason and the consequence of doing so very much up in the air. It's highly ambiguous in that sense. Antinatalism may sometimes be motivated by environmentalist concerns. While this can be true, it is not a feature, I think, of most contemporary philosophical antinatalism, and it is included here likely out of confusion with the meaning of the word pre-2006 because of groups like the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, Vehement, which of course does have a very strong environmentalist bent to it, and perhaps in ignorance of what antinatalism has become over the last 18 years, which does have different concerns primarily than environmentalist ones. Often comes from the negative perspective that all life is suffering. While this is true of some antinatalism, this would more accurately describe Buddhism, I think, or I suspect at least that is why they're saying this, that there's some sort of conflation happening here between antinatalism and Buddhism. So those are my critiques.
Thank you, Amanda. With that, we are beginning to saturate our observations and to have some sorely needed disagreement among the panelists. So now I can add to my list 9. Antinatalism is a philosophy and a social movement. So there goes Lawrence's non-engagement. 10. The question is ethical, not moral. Amanda, we'll have to do an episode on this for the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. I'm just a simple philosopher. I'm not sure what the difference is, although I've seen it mentioned in the Antinatalist online discussions. So an episode at some point?
Absolutely. We'll have to do that for sure.
Okay. We have also 11. The motivation for not having children should be specified for childlessness to be antinatalism. And then 12, antinatalism proper should be aware of its consequences, including, if consistent, human extinction. Amanda, you can't say that this is a family channel. Well, except, of course, that thinking about what all of us have said in the past, and is Karim, Lawrence, you, me, and at least one of the Davids who are on record saying that it's okay. So I'll let it slide this time. And we have David Pearce next. David, what are your thoughts?
I think the fairly bland, low-key Cambridge definition of antinatalism is a good fit for the dictionary. But compare the Cambridge definition of natalism. Natalism, 1, the idea that it is important to have children in order to increase the number of people in a country, especially the number of people who are not immigrants, in parentheses, equals people who have come to a different country in order to live there permanently, close parentheses. So as well as the entry for anti-natalism, I think Cambridge really needs a second entry for natalism 2, e.g. natalism 2, the life-affirming belief that it is morally good to have children or that people should be encouraged to have children. Natalism typically stems from the belief that life is fundamentally good and the pleasures of life outweigh its pains.
That's a very good point you're making, David. Thank you. Maybe we should write them a letter. Dear Cambridge Dictionary, we are a group of antinatalists and we are concerned about the maltreatment of our dear competitors, the natalists. Please rectify this immediately. Yours sincerely, and all our names. Or maybe not. We'll see. Anyway, moving on from David to David, we have David Benatar up next. David, do you have objections?
I do. My concern is just repeating so many things that have been said before. So one thing I could do is just highlight perhaps one or two rather than give a comprehensive list. You've enumerated a great number, Matti, from the earlier commentaries. I suppose my chief concern about the Cambridge definition is that it does seem restricted to human beings, and I would not restrict it. And then I do have the similar concerns about those particular examples. I worry about focusing unduly on environmental concerns. So yes, I would want to echo many of the earlier criticisms, but not all of them.
Fair enough. We did reach a saturation of sorts there, admittedly. But let me reverse the question here. in your case and ask you about the positives. Can you see anything good about the Cambridge Dictionary definition or the fact that the term that you and Théophile Le Giraud launched 18 years ago now finally was defined by a major English dictionary?
Well, I think it is a good thing, of course, that it is now in the dictionary, given how widespread the usage of it now is. So that is a good thing. And it's a good thing that it is in the vaguely correct direction, but it could be improved.
Thank you, David. And with that, we conclude our Cambridge Dictionary definition part of this panel and move on to our own definitions to see if we fare any better. Starting, since I already have your attention, with you, David, what's your definition?
Well, I want to provide multiple entries into the dictionary. For antinatalism, I want to have it described as an abstract noun, which is the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. And then I want to see it antinatalist also as a noun, designating somebody who espouses antinatalism, and then have antinatalist as an adjective defined as of or relating to a person, policy, practice, law, attitude, etc., that discourages or reduces the reproduction of sentient beings.
Thank you, David. With your particular history in this field, you are, of course, entitled to stipulate the meaning of these words. But let me ask you this specification. Do you think that the view that it is morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence corresponds with the way the word antinatalism is used by the average English speaker? For instance, if you saw a newspaper article with the title, "Antinatalism is gaining ground," would you assume that the article is about the morality of bringing sentient beings into existence?
Well, I think the point about any dictionary definition is that there's going to be very varying usage of a word. And if you want to accurately capture that, you'll have to have multiple entries or multiple disjunctions in your definition. And I think that any dictionary definition is going to need to steer the course, tread the line between having that kind of exhaustive definition and having one that is reasonably descriptive of the ordinary usage. So I have to recognize that up front. And I think there is a downside to having a very long definition that includes multiple disjunctions. So given that, and given that if you explore antinatalism, I think you're going to find that the arguments support its application to all sentient beings. That's not an unfair way of representing it. So if you're going to use the term in the most precise way that is also reflective of ordinary usage, the correct balance is to phrase it in the way that I phrased it. And then to some extent, people ought to conform their usage to that as opposed to merely having it reflect the way people use it.
Thank you, David. And next up, we have Karim Akerma. Karim, what are your definitions, please?
Okay, let me first come to what was introduced as a good, useful dictionary definition. Now, the term antinatalism encompasses attitudes, movements, and moral theories that advocate the non-procreation and non-creation of entities, biological organisms, or artificial non-organismic entities capable of suffering. I guess suffering is important here as opposed to sentience, but we will discuss that later maybe. Now, second good general definition for discussions among antinatalists, same as before. On top of that, antinatalism takes on a concise meaning against the backdrop of denatalism. While the latter advocates a mere reduction in the population of a country or an animal population, antinatalism stands for a general end to reproduction. Third, good specific definition that I would think specifies the most useful dimensions of antinatalism. Same as before, on top of that, thus antinatalism takes into account the disappearance of the human race by abstention from procreation, with many antinatalists also advocating the extinction of some or all animal species, as long as this end can be brought about without considerable suffering, for example, by benign neutering. A particularly controversial issue is the infamous red button thought experiment, which asks whether humans or animals would be harmed if their existence ended, for example, within a thousandth of a second after someone had pressed the also infamous red button.
Thank you, Karim. Wow, that was thorough. I see that your first formulation corresponds with certain extensions and specifications with David Benatar's definition. The second reminds us of the difference between population policies, your denatalism, and antinatalism proper. And the third reminds us of one of the major consequences of consistent antinatalism, the extinction of species. Very instructive. Thank you. Then we have Lawrence Anton. Lawrence, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matti. Yeah, so the definition that I am going to put forward is quite similar to David's, although a slight alteration. So I put forward the view that, so antinatalism is the view that bringing new human or sentient beings into existence is unethical. To quickly touch on the good, useful part of the definition. So I think this definition is good and useful because it's quite simple, easy to understand, and captures the essence of, I think, what both the layperson who maybe has a sort of basic familiarity with antinatalism and then antinatalists themselves tend to mean when they use the term antinatalism. And then for good general definitions for discussion among antinatalists, I think that my definition is good for that because it leaves open the potential motivations for the position, which may differ amongst antinatalists, as I'm sure we're all aware. And obviously, and the definition I put forward includes both an anthropocentric and sentiocentric scope, mentioning both humans and sentient beings. Which I think, again, leaves much room for discussion that I'm sure any antinatalist at all engaged with the community is aware that's a topic for discussion. So it leaves that open as to what scope is more appropriate. And then good specific definition that I think specifies the most useful dimensions of antinatalism. I think given that my definition centers around the sort of moral critique of or opposition to bringing new sentient beings into existence, which is sort of the core of antinatalism. So I think it sort of is useful and addresses the core dimensions there. Just a couple of few notes on maybe other benefits or drawbacks to my conclusion. So I think the benefits are that it's simple, easy to understand, leaves room for a broad understanding of antinatalism, both in scope and people's motivations. And also, I think it does generally capture what most people, both antinatalists themselves and non-antinatalists, understand it to be. Two quick drawbacks to my definition. So it could be too broad, leading to, obviously there are a wide range of motivations and scopes that fall under this definition I put forward. So it could result in some confusion, and it could, cause conflict over, what is the real meaning of antinatalism and people bickering over that. And also it doesn't, my personal motivations for being an antinatalist are very much centered in the philanthropic concerns, and those are not explicitly mentioned in the definition I put forward because I wanted to leave room for broad motivations like the voluntary human extinction movement, who aren't necessarily motivated by philanthropic concerns necessarily. So yeah, that is everything I had to say on mine.
Thank you, Lawrence. You are the first one now to mention people first. Karim had populations and the human race in the mix, but you started with bringing new human beings into existence and only then went for sentience. May I ask, Did you go human first because you were thinking about lexical definitions, how people actually use words, or did you do it because antinatalism in your book is primarily about people and their reproduction? And if the latter, how and why does the extinction of all sentient beings happen?
Yeah, so it's the first one you touched on. So I think when most people hear the term antinatalist that are familiar with it, they probably their mind goes straight to human reproduction. Or that is probably just because they're not as maybe sort of involved in the topic as maybe I am and we all are here. So personally, I do extend it to other sentient beings. I just included humans explicitly along with sentient beings because I think that's where most people's minds go to. So I just wanted to capture that. And then on your question about how do you make that extension to other sentient beings, well, I think all of the morally salient points made by antinatalists critiquing human procreation, I think almost all of them, especially if they're philanthropic critiques, carry over to other sentient beings. I think whilst other animals and maybe other sentient beings we're not aware of or haven't been produced yet, obviously they are different from us, but in the morally relevant ways, I think they are actually extremely similar. And so like other ethical issues like killing or controlling them in some other way, I think the critiques of those actions towards humans also carry to other animals. I think the antinatalist critique of procreation in the human context also carries over to us bringing other animals into existence as well. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you, Lawrence. That clarifies the matter. And then David Pearce. David, what's your definition?
Antinatalism is an ethical stance that says procreation is morally wrong. Antinatalists believe that bringing more involuntary suffering into the world without the prior consent of the victim is indefensible. Antinatalists range from soft antinatalists who believe that staying child-free or adopting a personal decision to strong or hard antinatalists who aim peacefully to bring about the extinction of all sentient life.
Thank you, David. Getting better and more nuances are piling up as we go. I can detect at least 3 new dimensions here. First, we only need to eliminate involuntary suffering. If someone genuinely wants pain, let them have it. Secondly, the unborn don't, as far as we know, want pain, so we don't have their consent to be born. Quite important. And thirdly, yes, some of us do believe that being childless for personal reasons fulfills the criteria of antinatalism, while others think that some degree of advocacy or persuasion or at least disapproval is also needed. As far as dictionary definitions go, the being voluntarily childless means being an antinatalist might well gain ground to the annoyance of what you have called the strong or hard wing of the movement. Anyway, talking about the hard wing of the movement, on we go to Amanda Sukenick. Amanda, your definition or definitions, if you please.
Thank you so much, Matti. So my first definition is extremely basic, maybe not a good dictionary definition, but I think gets to, or tries to get to the heart of something useful, which is antinatalism is a critique of procreation. I wanted to submit at least one extremely basic, pared down to its roots definitions of antinatalism because I personally believe that finding common ground in antinatalism amongst antinatalists is important, particularly in regards to its growth as a social movement and to its activism. Antinatalists often don't tend to agree on much, but one thing we can agree on no matter what, regardless of if we are antinatalist, child-free, EFIList, vehement, anatalist, anti-AI natalist, or what have you, is that there is something critiquable about procreation, and that is in fact what we are doing. We are critiquing procreation in some kind of way. A critique of procreating what or who or why exactly those details are left gloriously ambiguous in this definition. The point here is to think about what the kernel of agreement between all anti-procreative-like people might be, with the biggest, widest, most inclusive tent in mind. My second definition, antinatalism, is a philosophical position and social movement concerned with ending suffering by preventing the birth, manufacturing, creation, manipulation, and existence of sentience or possible sentience. My second definition also tries to offer a very wide tent definition of antinatalism in some respects, but is also admittedly speaking from a far narrower tent in others, and I think is trying to pick up on these, dimensions that I find to be of importance. First off, this definition immediately acknowledges that antinatalism is now not only a philosophy, but a social movement as well. Some antinatalists believe that antinatalism should be a social movement, while others, of course, would say that it should not be. Those that believe that it should not be a social movement generally also believe that if it's going to be, that those antinatalist social movements absolutely should not have goals, especially if those goals are extinctionist ones. So yes, this definition is speaking from a narrower antinatalist tent, which posits that antinatalism should indeed have the goal of ending suffering, which of course, makes this definition an inherently extinctionist one, and so would not apply to anyone espousing an anthropocentric and or non-extinctionist antinatalist position. I feel that the real strength of this definition is in its acknowledgement of at least some of the many ways that life, sentience, possible sentience, manipulation, and suffering can be both created and find itself in need of an end. These ways begin with being brought into existence through birth. It can be manufactured, as in the possibility of machine sentience. And by the word create, I was attempting to reference lives that are bred into existence, like farmed animals, but it could also apply to several different circumstances. I use the word manipulation not only because I wanted the definition to in some way acknowledge the work of Julio Cabrera, but also because the manipulation is a form of harm that isn't necessarily the same as suffering, and the prevention of manipulation is sometimes very much the motivation of some antinatalists and a separate concern from the focus of suffering. And the last part of my definition makes room for what we might not yet be considering: insentience, the meaningless liability and danger that type of life poses were it to gain sentience. The possible future horrors of evolution. This definition makes it clear that the scope of antinatalist concerns is an ever-widening one.
Thank you, Amanda. That concludes beautifully our own definition section and takes us to the general discussion. You may have questions or comments to one another. Just raise your hand and I'll give you the floor. Just to give you some background, there was some healthy disagreement showing in some of your comments and definitions. Maybe you would like to follow up on those. Some of the most prominent were perhaps, first, to what degree is antinatalism about human reproduction, primarily, only, or not at all? Your views seem to differ. Do you want to challenge one another on that? And secondly, none of you seem to accept population policies as antinatalism. Yet that is what antinatalism has meant to Malthusians for ages. Paul Ehrlich, whom Amanda and I interviewed some time ago, thinks so. So what gives you the right to rise above the popular opinion like that? Any takers? Yes, David Benatar. David, go ahead.
Thanks. I do have a few things to say about these various issues. Let me start off with what's a good definition, with what makes a good definition in general. And I want to just reiterate the point that I made earlier, that we're needing to tread a fine line between trying to be too inclusive of all the possible usages of a term and being insufficiently inclusive. So in general, definitions and dictionaries need to be relatively crisp. If you look at a dictionary, they're going to be relatively crisp definitions. Often they're going to be multiple meanings, but very long disjunctions and very long explanations with motivations for views, these are not typically features of a dictionary definition. So I would leave out questions about motivations, for example. I don't think that I've excluded the population issues from the definition that I've provided. Certainly, if you look at anti-natalist, where I say as an adjective of or relating to a person, policy, practice, law, here I think there's a clear application. Now, you could use antinatalism as an abstract noun to refer to, let's say, the movement in favor of a reduced population. That is a possibility, but I'm not sure that the definition needs to make specification of a movement. You can, and I think if you look at some other definitions, you will see of isms, you'll see the word movement included, and in other cases you won't. So you can speak, for example, about communism. At least some dictionary definitions of communism don't speak about it as a movement, but you can certainly have communist movements. So it's not obvious to me that because you can have a movement around a particular viewpoint, that you have to include that possibility in the definition. I'm not saying you must exclude it. It's just not obvious that you need to include it. And then on the point about humans versus humans or sentient animals, this is the point that Lawrence Anton was making. This is, I think, the hardest case for me about whether to reflect that feature of usage, because I think Lawrence is correct that some people will think of it in its application to human beings. And to the extent that you want to cover ordinary usage, it does seem valuable to include that possibility. But on the other hand, there are more and less precise usages of a term. And if all the arguments for a particular view happen to support opposition to all sentience, and if we are still in the early stages of the usage of the word antinatalism, there may be some way in which a more precise definition that's slightly less reflective of some people's usage might actually encourage usage in the right direction. And for that reason, I'm sort of unsure which way we should go. I think there's a case to be made for Lawrence's point, and I think there's a case to be made for the view that I've gone for.
Thank you very much, David. And Karim has his hand raised. So Karim, go on.
Okay, let me try and say a word about the former meaning of antinatalism. We have already broached the subject that formally the term antinatalism existed. It had been existing for decades, signifying mainly a reduction in countries' population. It had been used widely in the domain of population policies, such as have been applied in China, for example, or in India. So what we are doing now, we are capturing the term and we are trying to replace its content. It's like formerly antinatalism has been widely used. Now we are coming up as new antinatalists and we are powerful. There's also appears to be a relation between power and the ability to change the content of certain words. Namely, it looks like that the shell of the word antinatalism will be kept, but we are exchanging its context. And doing this, we are replacing the former content of the term antinatalism. And somehow, because of this, we are in a conceptual disarray. I don't say a conceptual mess, but actually we'd have to find a new home for the former content of the term antinatalism, which relates to population policies. And my suggestion is to call the new home for the former content of antinatalism denatalism, because it's much clearer. Denatalism just means diminish the number of people on a certain surface, namely country, in order to achieve certain goals. So if we succeed, we'd have antinatalism side by side with denatalism in one and the same dictionaries. And doing this, we might succeed in getting rid of a certain conceptual disarray we are experiencing now. Just these few words about denatalism, antinatalism, social power behind new definitions, because the former meaning of antinatalism doesn't have a social power behind it. For example, I try to give an example. I try to establish denatalism in the German Wikipedia, but I didn't succeed because Wikipedia's reviewers were telling me there are not sufficient occurrences of the word denatalism in the German language. So sorry, we can't allow you to establish denatalism as a new word in the Wikipedia.
I have recognized a couple of other hands in there, but Lawrence Anton seems to be the next. So Lawrence, please go ahead.
Cheers, Matti. Yeah, I wanted to say something I think which sort of follows on from what David was saying about the sort of the crisp nature of definitions in dictionaries. So one thing I've noticed in the antinatalist sphere, and I have, very likely been guilty of this myself in the past, but I've noticed that there's a great sort of there's often people will try to attach things to antinatalism because they see it as part of a cluster of beliefs, or they see like they identify a cluster of beliefs that you could maybe sort of identify all under the sort of banner of maybe suffering focused beliefs. And I think often they sort of take antinatalism and try to sort of bring those other things into the fold of antinatalism. And I think we need to be wary of inflating and making antinatalism become a sort of I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, but a sort of like a sort of obese almost term where it's got so many things under it that maybe even begin to conflict in some way. I kind of see the same with veganism as well. There is somewhat of a movement to decenter animals in veganism and make it a term that is just used as a general stance against oppression. And whilst I can understand the sentiments behind the people trying to do that, because they say if you are vegan, you should be, you're against the oppression of animals, you should be against all other forms of oppression. I can understand that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if you agree with that sentiment, you also agree that veganism should mean that you're against all oppression. You can hold veganism as a belief alongside these other beliefs. And I think that antinatalism sometimes falls victim to the same sort of urges that people may have. Just to give two examples, I often see and have had discussions with people in the past about the intervention into the reproduction of wild animals. Whilst I'm extremely sympathetic to the suffering of wild animals and believe that we should be open to human intervention in a reasonable way, in a considered way to help wild animals, I don't believe the intervention into the reproduction of wild animals is part of antinatalism, but it's something you can hold in tandem with it. I've also spoken in one of my videos about how I view antinatalism and extinctionism as defined as the view that extinction would be preferable to non-extinction or the continuation of a species. I see that as somewhat independent from antinatalism, but something that can be held in tandem with it. And I often see this urge that people have to bring these things together under one banner called antinatalism. And I think we have to be wary about inflating the idea too much so that it becomes unrecognizable. But that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Lawrence. David Benatar has been waiting for quite some time now, so he's on.
Well, I'm quite happy for others to speak who haven't spoken yet in the discussion. I'm happy to come in later.
No, David, it is your turn.
Okay. So let me address Karim Akerma's point about social power. Obviously, social power comes in degrees. I think the fact that he couldn't get the definition of denatalism put into Wikipedia indicates that he lacked the social powers that the editors of Wikipedia have. So I wouldn't want to overestimate his or our social power with regard to definitions. And the fact that Amanda tried so hard to get it into the Oxford English Dictionary and didn't succeed indicates a relative powerlessness, at least relative to the people who edit the Oxford English Dictionary. So that's one point. The other is that it's not clear to me that I've ignored the earlier usage of the term. I mean, it does seem to occur in what I've said about the adjectival form of antinatalist. Now, it is true that you could put a abstract noun equivalent of the adjective, something that corresponds to the adjectival form of antinatalist. But one of the ways in which you simplify definitions is by not, again, repeating all of these things under all of the formats. So I provided an abstract noun, which in some sense itself also applies to the earlier movements, because that view did think that it was morally wrong to bring some sentient beings into existence. But if you put the word some in, then the definition of antinatalism is going to become far too broad, because it's going to refer even to those people who think that there are these rare occasions where it's wrong to bring a sentient being into existence. So you're going to unnecessarily complicate the definition that way. So what I did is I tried to offer the abstract noun in a very general form, won't have universal applicability to all usages, and then to cover possibilities like the one that Dr. Akerma is thinking about under the adjectival form.
Thank you very much. I've recognized one more. Amanda, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Matti. I wanted to speak a little bit towards what Karim was saying, and also some comments on the general issue of conflation or non-conflation with the population control movement or population in general and antinatalism. Antinatalism, Karim, your comments on antinatalism prior to 2006, I have found examples of the word antinatal, far earlier. I mean, at least in the mid 1800s, in fact. So it's possible that the history of the meaning of the word is even more a mess, a conundrum. And I think there's some evidence that the meaning might have sort of come around back to itself in recent times, because it seems like those usages of the term applied to things like abortion, or it applied to procreative concerns that were not necessarily about population ethics, so to speak. And I don't have a great conclusive thesis on this just yet, but I mean, there does seem to be something more complicated going on there. And I personally hesitate to replace the term with denatalist, only because I think it might be more valuable to try to understand those usages of the term in their own identity, but that's a separate concern. Regarding population concerns, I mean, while I think that there are strong arguments to be made that antinatalism and population ethics are doing two very different things and making very different claims, I do think that it would be a mistake for us to completely divorce antinatalism from the fact that overpopulation is still a tremendous problem here on planet Earth that produces an immense amount of suffering to both humans and animal lives. I don't think that anything that perpetuates the creation of sentient lives can or should really be completely outside the bounds of antinatalist concerns. And I can't really see any good argument for there to be, other than the fact that there sometimes seems to be a palpable desire in some to extract antinatalism down to some kind of purity. And I just don't see that concern as much use ultimately towards the prevention of the unborn. And also, if we value antinatalism as for its activism, we will face all the same issues that population reductionists, population advocates will face, all the same challenges as to how to get people to think about procreation, how to get people to stop procreation. So I think it would behoove us to be careful about making the separation, because I think we have important things to learn from one another.
And thank you, Amanda. And Karim has something to say. I think that after him, we are rounding up this part of the panel and going on to the next one. But Karim.
All right. Thank you, Matti. I just wanted to spend a word on Lawrence's nice term, crisp definitions, because we have to ask ourselves, why actually are people opening dictionaries? In most cases, people are opening dictionaries because they want to settle their quarrels. And more often than not, the antinatalists are a bunch of quarreling people. So they would open up the dictionary. And I guess it's our duty to try and diminish the vagueness of the term antinatalism. And if, for example, the Cambridge Dictionary proceeded and integrated a second definition of the term antinatalism, namely a definition which is about population policy, then we had two definitions side by side, and the two entries wouldn't serve as a means in order to settle people's bickering and quarrels. So the question arises: are we prepared to have at some point in time two definitions, antinatalism and antinatalism, as this wouldn't serve to settle people's quarreling?
Thank you, Karim. And very interesting viewpoints. Thank you all. And now for something slightly different. We have some audience questions for you. And to present them to you, Lawrence, Anton. Lawrence, you have the floor.
Cheers, Matti. So ahead of this, we put out a form to capture people's, anyone who may be interested, and I'm sure many of the people who will view this session, capture how they define antinatalism. And then we went through and extracted a few of the responses that we thought would lead to interesting questions. Each of them are going to be sort of primarily aimed at either David Benatar, Karim Akerma, but obviously once they have then given their answers, it can open up to anyone making any comments. So please don't feel like you can't give any of your thoughts on any of these. So the first one will be primarily aimed at David Benatar, and then obviously anyone else can give their thoughts. So the response was, so antinatalism is an ethical view that any moral agent must not create any painient being. Painient being meaning any being capable of experiencing pain. And this is whether directly by procreating or indirectly by, for example, paying others to breed animals. Now, the question we have off the back of this response is, so it's widely recognized that antinatalists or antinatalism carries with it this duty for the individual to abstain from procreation, to not biologically reproduce themselves. Could there be other, perhaps less commonly recognized duties or obligations that follow from antinatalism, though, beyond our own personal reproductive decisions? If so, what could they be?
Thanks. Well, I purposefully phrased my definition of antinatalism as an abstract noun in a way that it would be broader than procreation. So just as a refresher, what I said was that it's the view that it's morally wrong to bring sentient beings into existence. Procreation would be one way of doing that, but breeding animals would be another way of doing that. And creating sentient artificial life would also be another way of doing that. So that's not so much procreation as creation. So I think that the definition I've provided is suitably broad, that it can incorporate all the concerns of the question I had.
Thank you, David. And Karim, did you want to say something?
Yes, I want to refer to Lawrence's mentioning of the nice term painient beings. I guess it's important because in some of our definitions, we talk about sentient beings rather than suffering beings capable of suffering or painient beings. It makes a difference because there might be living beings out there, as for example jellyfish, who are sentient or have mental properties without being capable of suffering or open for negative sensations. So I guess at any rate we should take care and use words such as painient beings or beings capable of suffering. I think it's very important to integrate this topic into any of our possible definitions.
Thank you. And I see one more hand, David Benatar. David, please go ahead.
Thanks. Sorry, I don't want to be disagreeable here, but I'm not sympathetic towards Dr. Akerma's recent suggestion as a dictionary definition. First of all, the word painient it's not if it's a word at all, it's not a widely recognized word. And it wouldn't be the natural one that you'd put in a dictionary definition to try to convey a view. And secondly, there seems to be some measure of sort of arcania here that's informing this particular point. I don't know whether it's true that jellyfish are sentient and yet can't feel pain. As far as I know, that's an open question. That once a being is capable of feeling, it seems to me it's going to be capable of feeling adverse feelings. And so that may be entirely fit with the empirical scenario as it is. And I'm not sure that we would need to manipulate a definition in order to account for either these kind of minutiae in academic debates, especially if they might settle in a direction that makes that kind of change unnecessary.
Thank you, David. That was good on the pain and sentience side. But the question, maybe I don't know if I heard it correctly or I'm interpreting it correctly, but I thought that this was the more was not so much about the sentient beings, other sentient beings apart from humans. It was more like, should we be doing more? Should we go on the street and in the street and carry some signs saying down with procreation or whatever it is? Should I go to my neighbor and ask them not to have children?
Yes, I guess it could be our duty not to spread organisms onto other planets. There are for many decades, there have been undertakings to investigate the atmospheres on planets of our solar system, or even touching down on other planets such as Mars, and if I'm not mistaken, Venus. And we can almost be sure that there will be microorganisms on satellites, on vehicles that touch down. So as antinatalists, we should take into account that whenever a human vehicle touches down, microorganisms might survive, and out of these microorganisms, more complicated forms of life or sentient organisms capable of suffering might evolve. So as antinatalists, we should address the responsible organizations and inform them about our points of view, such that possibly they in future refrain from sending satellites or vehicles to other planets.
Oh, this is what I love about antinatalism. You ask a simple question about your neighbors and they're having children or not, and you get Elon Musk and his panspermia plans thrown at your face. Wonderful. David Benatar.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to address that interpretation of the question. And again, I would not want to alter the definition for this reason. This is not consistent with what dictionaries do. If you look, for example, at a definition of liberalism in a dictionary, it's not going to tell you all the duties that a person has as a result of being a liberal, in part because there's going to be widespread disagreement between people, even between liberals, about what liberalism is going to imply in terms of what people's duties are. So the role of a definition is not to settle all philosophical questions. It's not to tell us what our moral duties are. It's to describe how words are used, but also to a certain extent to prescribe how they should be used.
This second question is primarily aimed at Karim, but again, anyone can give their thoughts after Karim's given his initial ones. So the response was, antinatalism is an offshoot of philosophical pessimism that asserts that creating morally relevant beings into existence is unethical. So the question off the back of that is, so the pronouncement that coming into existence is a harm or a serious harm could be characterized and has been characterized by some as more of a philosophically pessimist pronouncement rather than a distinctly antinatalist one. If we're to accept that, then where can we say that antinatalism diverges from and becomes distinct from philosophical pessimism as its own idea, distinct from that wider sort of philosophy?
Actually, if I'm not mistaken, in the history of philosophy, antinatalism indeed came into existence once as an offspring of pessimism, namely in the philosophy of German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. But with Arthur Schopenhauer, it was still an embryo, and we can follow the precise history of how and when antinatalism got rid of its metaphysical surroundings it still had when while being integrated into the metaphysical philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. So indeed, at least to me, it sounds reasonable to think of antinatalism as some kind of offspring that existed in embryo in former overarching pessimistic philosophies, but which then later on became a lone-standing moral theory.
I think a way of answering the question would perhaps be to focus on the chicken-egg issue here. I mean, philosophy, and that's okay, but our deduction can start from pessimism, in which case it goes, life sucks, so how should we deal with that? And then we realize that one alternative is to stop procreation, to be ethical, to break the cycle, to be saints and heroes. In this case, pessimism is transformed into antinatalism by a shift from abstract theory to concrete practice. The move is not necessary, but it's possible. Our deduction can, however, also start from the other end, the rejection of reproduction, in which case it goes, I'm not having children, so how could I justify this to other people? Well, one alternative is to assume a pessimistic view. Life sucks, that's why I don't perpetuate it. Again, I'm a saint and I'm a hero. In this case, voluntary childlessness, a practice, seeks help from pessimism, a theory. Again, the move is not necessary, but it's possible or something. Sorry, anyway, after these audience involvements and your moderator overstepping the boundaries of his role, have any new questions arisen among the panelists? Or are there any concluding words that you'd like to say? Let's take a round to find out. Lawrence, Anton.
I would just like to say thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone, obviously, for giving up their time to join each of us in the panel.
Karim Akerma.
Thank you for having me, and hopefully our assembly will contribute to at least settle some quarrels which might come up in future.
David Benatar.
Thanks. I also don't have anything else to add other than to thank you for organizing it and to the other panelists for the fruitful discussion.
And I am Matti Häyry, and I have enjoyed moderating this Defining Antinatalism panel very much. And it is time for me to bow out and leave the stage to our host, Amanda Sukenick, for her concluding words. Amanda.
Thank you, Matti. Gentlemen, this has truly been an antinatalist event like no other, and I want to say a most sincere thank you to all 5 of you for agreeing to assemble here today. for all the time and effort that each of you dedicated into the preparation for today's event. To my two esteemed co-producers of today's event, Matti Häyry and Lawrence Anton, a pleasure as always, guys. Thank you so much to both of you. To Matti now specifically, what a wonderful moderator you are, Matti. You were the glue that held us all together today, and you steered this ship to what I feel to be a stunning victory. So thank you so much, Matti. And to our wonderful guests, David Pearce, Karim Akerma, and Professor David Benatar, your works, along with that of course, Matti's and of course, Lawrence's, have all been instrumental in shaping what antinatalism is today, and any panel attempting to answer the question of how antinatalism should be defined simply would not be complete without each of your voices. A tremendous honor to have each of you with me here today. Thank you all so much for everything that you do and for participating in this important conversation. To our audience, we also hope that you enjoyed our discussion today. Please think of this event as a type of beginning, not an end. Through the sum of our efforts here today, we have not, in fact, answered the question, how should antinatalism be defined? We have merely scratched the surface, and the same questions still remain. So let's keep having this crucial conversation. We hope that everyone in our community will continue to think about what it is that we are doing and believing in, and continue to keep trying to define antinatalism towards perfection. Once again, thank you so much to everyone. All the best, and bye for now.